Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off.
Welcome to another Climate Tech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. Will Wiseman is a Forbes 30 Under 30 founder who's on a mission to democratize investing in renewable energy. He co-founded Climatize, which allows people to invest as little as $5 just 2 years ago, and it's going well. We talked about how Will got started, his experiences abroad in Europe, and the role of microloans in electrifying the grid. I reached Will in California. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Will, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Ryan, thanks for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
You started Climatize 2 years ago with the mission to democratize investing in renewable energy. What about democratizing investing in renewable energy is so important to you?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So to me, I think investing in the renewable energy transition is a really important mission because, frankly, we're seeing all of this growing demand from the renewable energy kind of the coalitions, Sunrise movement. The everyday person is really demanding action on climate. And yet we are not seeing the kind of movement from the top level at the pace that we really need to hit these scientific targets. And so for me, as I look at kind of climate change as a really big, hairy problem, but at the same time, an enormous economic opportunity, I think it's very important that we engage and bring the public along as active stakeholders in this transition and really share the yield of this opportunity with the broad public. And that's a big part of how we're going to kind of build the coalitions necessary to actually kind of re-architect our society and decarbonize the overall global economy. And if we look at, for example, just energy as a commodity, it is the single most used commodity across the whole world, across the global economy. And, many of the largest kind of entities in the world are energy companies, or beyond that, petrostates. You look at the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, they have enormous natural resources in terms of energy. And now, same thing, large market cap kind of energy companies, BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, there's enormous companies that have this kind of stranglehold on power through their ability to sell and arbitrage energy. And then if we look at the kind of transition to the renewable energy world, now all of a sudden, you don't necessarily have the kind of constraints around supply that you would say with the wind and sun. And so now as we look to kind of do a distributed energy world, I think it's very important that, as we break up that power and those kind of incumbent strangleholds on power, to be able to distribute that power and the financial kind of yield from that back to the people and help them kind of now share in the benefits of the energy transition.
So renewable energy production is quite often more distributed, so maybe the ownership should be as well. So what does Climatize do?
Yeah, so Climatize is a SEC registered funding portal. And what that means is we are able to do crowdfunding raises. And we have really focused in on doing that actually for the debt financing of renewable energy projects. And this is, essentially expanding the access to an asset class that previously was kind of exclusively invested in by qualified institutions, banks, pension funds, insurance groups, and then additionally high net worth individuals and kind of credit facilities. And so by being able to now expand access to invest in this asset class, we see this as a real way to kind of drive local engagement in local clean energy projects. And through Climatize, you could invest in, the solar project that's on the theater in your town or, on that industrial building. And through that, you can earn a competitive return on investment while at the same time supporting clean energy in your community, helping, local jobs, providing energy security. There's a broad array of benefits from actually funding these projects. And through Climatize, you can actually see the end product of your money. You could go and drive to that building and actually see that solar project that you helped fund and invest in. And that's in contrast to kind of some of the other green investment options currently available where you don't really know the impact of ultimately what your money went to do.
And since these are SEC regulated financial instruments, probably you've got to say something about this not being investment advice. And you've probably got some memorized statement that you should share right now to keep everyone happy and keep your compliance team happy.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think our compliance team will appreciate that. So, as with anything, this is not investment advice. I would encourage you to do your own homework. Private investing is highly risky. And so you should always make decisions based on your own portfolio allocation strategy. So yeah, thank you for helping me get that out of the way. And yeah, it enables us to, have a little bit more of a broad conversation about this asset class and kind of why it's exciting to now expand that as a tool for climate action.
So it's project financing that's available, that's democratized. So it's available in very small chunks, as little as $5 per project. Mm-hmm. And you say they're projects that people can basically see, kick the tires on. They're maybe in their region. Are you purely in the US right now? Can you talk a little bit about the types of projects? So is this like solar on a shopping mall nearby and people like choose these specific projects and invest in those and there's like a defined return on the loan?
Yeah. So currently, because we're using U.S. securities laws, the companies that are raising this debt financing have to be U.S.-based entities. And then from that, actually, there can be an international footprint if the company has its headquarters in the U.S. So that's one nuance. But for the time being, we've really been focusing on projects here in the U.S. So, a couple of the projects that we've recently helped raise funding through Climatize, there was a Shakespeare theater in New Jersey, additionally, another synagogue nearby in New Jersey. And then before that, a community solar project in East Longmeadow, Massachusetts, just as a couple examples of projects that have been funded through the platform. And now, coming to our desk, we're really excited to see the deal flow that's been coming through. Some of them have really great stories. As we look, we try and often find projects that have that nice kind of human element and a story behind it as well, so that you can see that ultimately the project that you're investing in is, helping climate, but also helping those communities. And some, as we've done customer research, we've found that projects that help children, for example, really transcend kind of borders and any affiliations beyond that. And so, as we, for example, are looking at a project that's a Boys and Girls Club, that's something that you can feel really good about, knowing that you're investing in kind of community institutions, that you're helping them reduce their energy costs and at the same time fighting climate change hand in hand.
Very cool. And what would you say the breakdown is of the types of projects? Are these mostly community solar projects, or are they mostly small scale solar together with kind of a commercial property?
So generally, we've started out with solar. That's really where our team's expertise comes in. So I've been in the clean energy industry for the past 10 years and actually started my career as a solar installer. So I've built 15 solar projects with my own two hands. And so know them very, very intimately, from actually being on the roof, putting in racking, wiring them all up, getting them interconnected all the way through then to system design, interconnection, now permitting, engineering, the whole stack. And so that's why we really started with this segment as A, it's what we're best at, but also B, where we've seen kind of, solar is a little bit more commoditized these days. The technology is much later in its life cycle. And so with that, you have much less of the technology risk inherent with kind of some of these emerging technologies. And then at the same time, one of the problems that we found is that those big utility scale projects out in the desert, $100 million projects, they're getting funded by banks. But if you then look down to the smaller end of the spectrum, where essentially it's called a $5 million project and below, those projects are just not being funded. And, there are kind of both technical and social benefits to those projects because they are lower voltage. They then oftentimes don't require the same kind of grid upgrades, which means that, they can make it oftentimes through the interconnection process with minimal cost adage on top. They're closer to demand centers. They can be co-located, so they serve as a new revenue stream potentially for some of these businesses. So there's lots of kind of bundled advantages to these small distributed energy resources. And so we're really excited to be able to now incorporate the community as another stakeholder and another source of capital so that people can really feel that when they go to deploy capital to fighting climate change, that it's happening in their communities in a way that's local and tangible.
I talk to a lot of people in climate finance, and you're probably then in a very small minority of people who are actually on roofs installing installing solar panels, which means you probably know it pretty well, and from, definitely a kind of more well, I won't say ground up because you're on roofs, but
From the roof up. Yeah.
From the roof up. You mentioned that you've been in this space for 10 years and you have an education in climate engineering. Were you ever tempted to build renewable energy projects instead and build a renewable energy company rather than a company that finances renewable energy projects?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So actually, I had been working in large-scale electrical project management and had been really doing some of the engineering side from more so the back office. And in that role, I didn't feel like my impact was going to be kind of to the scale that I have ambitions for myself. And as I saw that each one of those projects was going to be 3 to 4 years, I felt like, wow, I need to do more. We need to move faster. My role needs to be bigger. And it wasn't then until kind of seeing kind of the global climate strikes and ultimately then seeing that capital could be a way for me to play a very high leverage role in this industry, that I didn't necessarily have to be the engineer on every single project. Rather, if I could speak the same language as them, if I could bring that expertise to the table as a financier, then I could have a much more kind of technically fluent conversation. I could have a more flexible conversation. I could really understand the needs of that developer and bring that capital to the table so that I could help those developers accelerate and do what they're very good at. And that's where I saw that, rather than being the guy for 3 to 4 years on any project, I could instead enable these developers to now go on and, really do their work and enable more projects to come to fruition. And so that was ultimately why I kind of shifted seats at the table. And now, having sat in every chair at the table, I think it gives me a very good kind of holistic understanding of what the needs are.
Project finance is hard. Project finance for energy is hard. Getting through SEC regulations is very, very hard. So yeah, you chose kind of like the black diamond if you're, a skier to slope to go down. So, I mean, you're basically creating financial securities here. What was the process like? Where do you start? I mean, did you just Google it one day and say, how do I create, how do I democratize projects, renewable energy projects, and create financial securities out of this? What does the process look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I think one of the superpowers that every founder needs to have is kind of the ability to go and teach themselves. And so as an engineer, I kind of built that skill set early on to be able to go and kind of tackle really complex topics and digest them and ultimately then kind of design, blueprint a plan to be able to go and achieve that. And so, we actually, funny enough, we started the company in Europe where renewable energy crowdfunding was a much more kind of developed industry. And from that, had really learned from best practices there and understood kind of some of the barriers to scale that had occurred kind of in that market. And then we ultimately won grant funding from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority to come and build this in the United States. And so when we made that transition, fortunately, then all of a sudden we had, kind of government backing, as well as we were able to secure pro bono legal representation by Morrison Foerster. And they were very pivotal in our journey in enabling us to, jump through the myriad of hoops that ultimately stand between, this idea and actually being able to go out and execute on that and be able to help these projects raise capital. I mean, as with anything, a compliant industry, you have many kind of overhead costs and procedures to be able to work with to actually run this business. And so, to the extent that you can kind of test as an entrepreneur, that's often what you need to do early on is put together that spit and duct tape prototype. And for us in the beginning, that was really hard. Actually, the very first kind of validation of Climatize was for my 25th birthday. We went to try and crowdfund $2,500 to fund a small solar project in Kenya. And we exceeded the target. And actually, through that was how we were connected with Andy Ballister, the co-founder of GoFundMe. He discovered what we were working on and thought it was a really exciting project. It was something that was kind of close to his heart. He made the very first kind of angel investment into the company. And from there, that helped us kind of get up and we were off to the races and built the first prototypes, jumped through those hoops, and were able to launch, get everything done. It took a full year of regulatory approvals, paperwork, all that fun stuff. And then we're able to launch in May of this year. And since then, we've raised $1.5 million for these solar projects across the country. So it's been an exciting journey, not without its, trials and tribulations, but has been something that has been incredibly rewarding along the way.
Congratulations. And it's a great backer to have also for the company. I'm interested about the investors, not so much in the company, but the investors in the projects, which are basically your user base and how they find you. Is there a general kind of profile? You say as little as $5 in a project. I'm guessing the average ticket size is probably higher than that. And maybe relatedly, I see that you're an active investor in Kiva, which is an organization I love, which is an impact microloans platform that also lets people invest as little as $5. I've been using it since, for at least 10 or 15 years. And I wonder if did you borrow some inspiration from that as well? Seems like a kind of similar idea, except that you're focused specifically on distributed energy projects.
Sure. Yeah. So starting with the Kiva kind of element, very pivotal in my journey to founding Climatize. It was something that I've been lending through Kiva for almost 14 years now. And many years ago, my aunt, she gave me the first credits through Kiva, $50. And I've been able to then recycle that to help 12 different entrepreneurs around the world. And to me, at an early age, that idea that essentially that same quantity of money could be recycled and create that same impact around the world was a very kind of inspiring, intriguing concept. And so that had been kind of something I was noodling on. And then it wasn't until also I saw Scott Harrison from Charity Water speak at my university during my undergraduate degree, where he really spoke to kind of the transparency that they had created in the philanthropy space and how being able to see ultimately, the water project that you put your money towards, how that level of direct A to B line of sight impact was so pivotal to their growth in the philanthropy space that it was the same awareness of the Kiva platform of knowing the story of the individual and knowing the impact of my money. And so together, those two kind of formed, what if we could do this for clean energy? What if different cause, but kind of similar principles could be applied and scaled globally? And so that was very kind of central to the Climatize journey. And then to your question about kind of spread of investors, it's been really exciting to see. We have everything from the $5 investor, the person who is, early in their kind of career and they're looking to put what they can towards this asset class and they want to invest along, their kind of impact, desires. And then at the same time, we have the other end of the spectrum as well, family offices and foundations that are, putting serious capital work because, they can actually really see what they're putting their money towards. And through that, it can align with their climate goals or their decarbonization goals. And so really have been able to foster the whole length of the spectrum there, which to me is really exciting because that's kind of the whole premise. The community can come together regardless of kind of your capacity to invest and bring these projects to fruition.
That's incredible. I mean, I think also, Kiva's addictive. I remember when I made my first investments in a new kind of like, wow. And you start shopping through and looking at all these lives that you can impact for as little as, $50 or these basically small tickets and reinvesting them. And, you start giving them out as speakers gifts or, presents or these types of things. And I think there are a lot of impact investors today who got their start with a $50 Kiva gift card. And so you might be creating a new generation of renewable energy investors while you're at it.
Yeah. And, with the craziness of the entrepreneurial journey, I've been really lucky to then be able to speak to the founders of Kiva. And it's incredible that, when you set off on this journey, you never really know where you're going to end up. And sometimes you fail fast and sometimes it takes you places that you would never expect. And so almost like meeting my heroes along the journey as one of just the perks of building and scaling this platform has been a real treat for me.
Better to succeed slowly than to fail fast, I guess. So someone who's looking at this from a financial perspective and kind of wants to be involved in the renewable energy markets, if they're looking at investing directly in projects through your platform versus like, say, an ETF, an energy ETF or an ESG ETF, what would you tell them? Again, not giving investment advice, but what would the thinking be in choosing kind of one instrument over the other?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, again, not investment advice, but looking at this, then there are kind of two sides of your portfolio. So, if you're looking at ESG kind of index funds, ETFs, that's going to be the equity side of your portfolio, while we're really actually on the debt side. So, this is kind of structured like a bond in that sense. So, it has a fixed interest rate, oftentimes a set term. And from there, because ultimately what you're doing is essentially buying credit against a project. You are the creditor for those projects. And so with that, they're borrowing that cash. Those projects have contracted cash flows through a power purchase agreement, and then they use the asset as another form of collateral. So between that, you're actually investing in an asset-backed security. And so you could look at this as, okay, I have kind of alternative options in bonds or maybe CDs would be kind of the closest analog to kind of the financial product that we offer on Climatize. And then, from that, there is a kind of risk return ratio there that you would have to look at to say, hey, is this kind of aligned with my portfolio? And, does the return profile on these debt notes ultimately align with the risk that I feel is embedded within these projects? And so when you're looking at a project that has contracted cash flows, it's a physical asset generating cash from the sun coming up. We as a platform do due diligence on, do they have all of their permits in place, operations and maintenance contracts? Do they have their, site leases, environmental studies, all of the stuff that's necessary for that project to ultimately come to life? And we have that checklist that we run through before enabling any project to raise on our platform, because we also want the security to be something that's readily accessible and can just be taken off the shelf by an investor without necessarily having to need a full climate and renewable energy engineering background to come in and even begin kind of looking at these offerings. So kind of non-correlated asset, really on the debt side, kind of bond side of your portfolio. And then from there, if you feel like, hey, this risk profile is aligned with what I would like, then, they can potentially offer a nice kind of yield premium to the bond side of your portfolio.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that platforms like this have existed in Europe before. I remember seeing something like this in Germany a number of years back. Mm-hmm. You've actually spent a lot of time in Europe, and the last several years, you've sort of been splitting your time between California and Barcelona and Stockholm, if I remember correctly. And I wonder what, if you have any insights into what the differences are, maybe in terms of people's perception to investing in renewable energy, in terms of uptake in renewable energy. I mean, California is pretty progressive when it comes to this topic, not necessarily representative of the whole country in that respect. But I just wonder what your takeaways are as someone who's been spending a lot of time between the two continents. I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice, don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Paracar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate.
Sure. In terms of the entrepreneurial ecosystems, or in terms of kind of inclination for investing in renewable energy?
Maybe both. And I think they might have some overlap as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start with the renewable energy one. So I would say Europe is a little bit farther along when it comes to investing in renewable energy projects. I mean, now the US has really key driving policy, namely the Inflation Reduction Act, that makes these projects more profitable. And through that, there has been more attention on the space. However, Europe has been a little bit more forward thinking when it comes to the energy transition and investing in kind of green infrastructure. And in part, this actually goes back to some of my earliest comments about kind of resource allocation globally, where Europe doesn't have a lot of fossil fuels. There's coal in Germany and there's some natural gas in Spain, but not nearly as much as the US. And so for them, geopolitically, it's enormously to their advantage to get off of dependency of foreign fossil fuels. And so for them, they've been investing in kind of green infrastructure for a longer time, as well as I think that there is, at least my observation is, there's a greater willingness to potentially kind of give up some returns in return for kind of investing along values lines and kind of in thematic verticals that align with kind of the investors' desires over chasing yield. Now, in the US, this is growing as, now the Inflation Reduction Act brings new project offerings, and it really accelerates kind of the deployment of this infrastructure. But I wouldn't say that it's readily grown quite so quickly because, we still have a lot of kind of political discourse around the legitimacy of ESG. And I think that's kind of currently the lever that's in place as most investors see for kind of investing along environment. And so we really want to provide an alternative to that says, hey, we're squarely in the E bucket. We're really just doing environment. And hopefully we're bucketing in some S, some social impact as well, and providing you that really kind of like transparent environmental investment opportunity. Then when it comes to kind of the entrepreneurial ecosystems, something that I observed was really a kind of step shift in valuations. With the US, I think that there is a greater kind of culture of selling the moon, really selling a big vision, big valuations, big investment rounds, and kind of taking that risk for the potential return and coming in and really then kind of looking to hyperscale and looking for those kind of hypergrowth companies. Whereas in Europe, there was a little bit greater kind of emphasis on unit economics, profitability, early traction, something, for example, that might be a seed round in the US was more like a Series A company in Europe. And so the kind of hurdles and expectations of company maturity for fundraising they're kind of slightly offset. Now, one actually really interesting kind of change there is that just yesterday I was reading the State of Climate FinTech kind of market outlook. And that's kind of the industry vertical that we sit very squarely in. And Europe has really been the leader when it comes to climate fintech. And so it's interesting now, kind of as we see different specializations in different technologies, to see if kind of new geographic regions ultimately begin to kind of distance themselves as front runners in terms of traction and industry growth. So that's one that I'm definitely keeping an eye on. And we still have a handful of friends over in Europe that are, building some really exciting companies in the climate fintech space. I would say, namely, Deconomy is a very interesting one. They do kind of carbon footprint visibility for banks. So being able to see, the carbon footprint of every transaction that you make and really adding that visibility into a user-facing application so that just like, for example, in the US, we have the 2,000 calorie diet, normalizing those numbers so that people begin to kind of wrap their heads around their carbon footprint as a consumer and understand kind of where the benchmarks in a way that currently really isn't in the kind of fluency and conversation of the everyday consumer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I feel sometimes like the European investors are looking for revenue a little bit faster. They're maybe the U.S. investors are a bit more open to moonshot type projects. But it's been really fascinating to see, especially if I look at Germany, where a lot of B2B SaaS entrepreneurs, millennial entrepreneurs who started something kind of early 2010s have sold, in the past few years for big money, and a lot of them are starting their own climate tech funds and kind of really focusing on this topic. And it's been interesting to see Berlin, a city that I've spent a number of years in, also become quite a large player in climate tech. You spent a lot of time in Barcelona as well, and you were one of 100,000 people in the climate strike a few years back, and that was a watershed moment for you, I guess, also where you felt like you need to do more than just hold a cardboard sign. What did it feel like in that moment, and what was going through your head?
Yeah, so I think for me, that climate strike was very catalytic because as someone who was passionate about climate, it had always felt a little bit behind the scenes. It's not often something that we wear on our sleeve and are very, kind of forward facing with. And for me, that was the first time that I had seen in mass an enormous turnout of people really demanding action on climate. I had been to numerous climate strikes before that, but never to that scale. And so in that moment, it was very eye-opening to me because it was like, here are the people, here are my people, here's the community. And yet, we're all going to go home and nothing is going to be different. And how is it that we can actually then drive, tangible carbon reduction from all of this pent-up demand? And that was really then kind of the catalytic, like, how do we solve for this problem? If there are 100,000 people in Barcelona, and that's one of hundreds of cities, Berlin had 1 million people. If there are 7.6 million people who showed up for those strikes around the world, how is it that we make them active stakeholders and that they actually share in the benefits of the energy transition? Because if we don't, then we're never going to move fast enough. If everyone in those protests is just relegated to the sidelines, then we're missing an enormous opportunity to really accelerate this transition. And so that's really been kind of the heart and soul behind Climatize, is to enable those people to really lean in and choose a future that they want to live.
Yeah, I was one of the 1 million in Berlin, and indeed, it really felt like quite a big moment, and interesting to see the groups of people, a lot of young people, not surprisingly, I guess, but the number of companies, as ours did, that just basically said, you've got the day off if you're going to the climate strike. And it was a great moment. And I hope, it seems like a million years ago now, but we probably need to do something like this again, some large kind of mass movement.
I think it speaks to the social zeitgeist shift that is happening kind of in the undercurrents of society. Ultimately, when I got into the industry back in 2014, solar was much more expensive. The conversation wasn't there. We weren't really moving. Nowadays, if you look at the Super Bowl commercials, they're all EVs. If I had told you that 5 years ago, you would have thought I was absolutely crazy. And now the fact that this is kind of in the mainstream, in that central conversation, and, you have cool cars coming out. Tesla is like a status signal. Things like that are these subtle shifts that actually signal that we are making, these big kind of steps in terms of reaching that tipping point. And that tipping point is not at 51%. The snowball begins to move and the flywheel begins to turn much, much earlier than that. And so those are big shifts that I'm really excited to see and really try and point people's attention to as, hey, these are the very promising signals that we need to be aware of that, 5 years ago just really weren't there. And I will give a lot of credit, I think, to the youth climate movement and Greta Thunberg through Fridays for Future for helping really stimulate this and bringing it to the forefront into the streets so that people see that, there is this pent up demand, there is this growing anxiety around the world that we have to inherit and live with.
Yeah, it's been incredible. That movement, and especially now when you see leaders of companies and people talk about, well, there's only so much we can do, and then you point to what was done by one 16-year-old schoolgirl and the movement that she started and how things have coalesced around that. It kind of voids that argument. You and your co-founder Alba Forns made it to the Forbes 30 under 30 list recently. Congratulations on that. I wonder what that has meant to the company. Has the additional profile helped and made you more visible?
Yeah, definitely. So we actually were just at the Forbes 30 under 30 summit about 2 weeks ago, and it was a really incredible experience to go and surround ourselves with, young professionals really looking to shake up their industries across healthcare, fashion, the creator economy, energy, finance, the whole gambit. And that was really exciting for us. I would say, with any of those awards, you still have to wake up the next day and continue on your path. But it is often, it's a good signal that you're headed in the right direction. And it's a good validation that, you're actually making ripples potentially bigger than you really perceived in that moment. Because as operators, we're so in the trenches in terms of building our companies. And when you actually kind of come up for air and get to take a moment to take your flowers and kind of enjoy those awards, it really does help kind of build your confidence. And it's almost like the little blue check on social media that says, hey, you're legit, you're verified, you're going in the right direction, keep it up. And so with that, just incredibly grateful for the opportunity that we've had and the recognition we've received.
Yeah, as entrepreneurs, it's very easy to not celebrate the wins and just focus on what the next challenge is. And sometimes just for the endurance, you need to stop and smell the roses and appreciate the acknowledgement. Will, where's the best place to find you online?
Yeah. So, I think the best place for people to reach out to me is on LinkedIn. You can find me at Will Wiseman. I am happy to, field questions about how to get involved in the clean energy industry. Take a look at Climatize. You can download it on the App Store and take a look at the project offerings that we currently have. And then you can also reach out to me via email, will@climatize.earth.
And none of that is investment advice.
Yep.
One time. Will, thanks a lot for being here.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening to another Climate Tech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.